about to start with the second session of our seminar. As I said when we started, this is really part of the four-day seminar series that we've put together. So Vashna, Dr. Jagannath, is the first leg of the seminar, and we're going to give over to Richard, Dr. Richard Pithouse, who's also currently based at the university, currently known as Rhodes. He's not a stranger to activism and working with social movements. He's done quite a lot of that in KwaZulu-Natal, but also in other spaces. He writes quite a lot about the urban studies and all those things. He's also quite, what do I say this? I think quite passionate about the Frantz Fanon and the ideas and intellectual influences that he's had, but also the intellectual influences on him. But he also teaches contemporary political theory at the university currently known as Rhodes. Richard, we're very excited to have you here at the Chisimani Center for Activist Education. And yeah, without any further delay, I'm just going to hand over to you to take us through.
Thank you. I mean, I'm obviously very pleased to be here as well. It sounds like a very encouraging and potentially important initiative. And whenever, you know, a group of people at 5 o'clock in the afternoon get together to talk about ideas, that's just like tremendously exciting. So I'm, in the next few days, going to be speaking primarily about Fanon and a little bit about the urban question. Those are things that I've been teaching Fanon since 1995, the University of Durban, Westville, and I've been writing on Fanon for a long time as well. And I've also done quite a bit of work on urban stuff. What I want to talk about tonight is not stuff that I have particularly researched or done original work on, but it's something that I think can resonate with some of the questions that have been asked, particularly by young people, particularly since last year, and I think offers us a way of thinking critically about where we're at as a society, but also about where things are globally and how we got to be in the mess that we're in. It's also, I think, a set of useful ideas for making sense of how we locate Fanon historically, but also as a thinker. And what I want to talk about tonight is a certain dimension of a set of ideas that, while not entirely hegemonic, are very, very powerful in our society and in the world. I'm talking about liberalism, about liberal thought. You know, we all know that in 1990, at the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, socialist ideas, communist ideas appeared discredited to many people. The kind of overt racism that apartheid was a kind of late example of was discredited, and liberal ideas at that point, for many people, were not discredited. And many of the struggles that people had waged in this country got very rapidly translated into liberal idioms, liberal ideas. You know, I'm old enough, not by a long way, but enough, to have been around a little bit in the 1980s and to remember the things that people were struggling for, what they said they wanted, and to have witnessed this kind of shift. You know, people were talking, for instance, about wanting control over their lives, over their communities, over their workplaces. And suddenly you had everything just being about the vote, you know, just being about representative democracy, for instance. People wanting substantive changes in the realm of the material, with land and other aspects of the economy. And that just suddenly dissipating. You know, as Pendile said, I teach politics at the university currently known as Rhodes. And I would say at that institution, liberal ideas have been, they're subject now to challenge, largely from students, but liberal ideas have been overwhelmingly hegemonic. If you are a first-year student at Rhodes, you will get a textbook It's called Puzzles in Political Philosophy. It's not written by people who are marginal in this society. The three people who've put that book together are all people in whom the society is in different ways investing in the name of the transformation project, and in a big way, you know, through the state, through other ways, through university structures. In that textbook, which first-year students read every year, there's a statement that says, for most people, the conversation about freedom begins with John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is an English philosopher, a liberal philosopher, and this is what is presented, that this is where the conversation about freedom begins. Now, I want to suggest that that's fundamentally problematic, and that common sense is a part, perhaps a small part, but part of the explanation for why we have failed, often really quite dramatically, to grasp the nettle of the problems that we face as a society. Now, liberalism, and you'll see this all the time with a lot of responses, say, to contemporary cases of terror in cities like Paris or Brussels, claims for itself often a real moral superiority. It often, you know, the failings of nationalism, of Marxism will be pointed to, and often those will be genuine failings. But liberalism will be presented, as it was in South Africa at the end of the Cold War, at the end of apartheid, as having emerged kind of unscathed, with its credibility intact. And those kinds of arguments will sometimes reach back, when they're pointed to the superiority of liberalism, as way back sometimes as 1215 with the Magna Carta in England. Magna Carta is a document that awards a set of rights to the aristocrats in England. It comes out of conflict between the barons and the English king, some of which, you know, kind of comes to us through children's stories, through the story of Robin Hood. You know, that's the kind of period. And the Magna Carta gives rights that have been written into constitutions or into law that still hold today. So, for example, the idea that you shouldn't be sentenced to prison without having a fair trial, that you should be able to confront your accuser, that evidence should be tested publicly. These kinds of things are there in the Magna Carta. But the Magna Carta isn't simply a story of enlightenment emerging in 13th century England. The backdrop to the Magna Carta is the Crusades. It's often the second sons of aristocrats who are not going to inherit in England, raising armies in the name of religion to invade the part of the world that we now call the Middle East. And if you read the Magna Carta very carefully, it's very clear that the rights that are being spoken about there are for Englishmen. These are not presented at all as universal rights. So the Magna Carta emerges at a time of real social conflict in England between dispossessed people and elites. That conflict is often framed in religious language, people in joining various heretical sects that claim to be able to reinterpret the Bible themselves, to take that power away from the priestly class, and argue that things like, to say for instance, that land should be held in common, and that is the intention of God, that is the divine plan, that land should not be privately owned. There's real conflict in England. One way of containing that conflict is for the king to give the aristocrats a certain set of rights at the expense of ordinary people in England, but also very much at the expense of people outside of England who start to become defined as the other. As the East becomes defined as a space where the normal rules don't apply, where you can do things that you can't do in England. Okay? But another very, very important date in the development of the idea in particular of Europe as a kind of political project rather than just a place in the world would be 1492. Now, I mean, I'm sure you all know that's when Columbus arrives in the Caribbean, okay? But it's also the year when Isabel and Ferdinand, extreme kind of Catholic fundamentalists, a bit like ISIS is with regard to Islam today, expel the Arabs and the Jews from Spain. Europe can now be conceived, it's a bit unstable still, but it can be conceived as Christian. But at this very same moment, European naval power gives Europe the capacity to conquer people elsewhere in the world. Now, conquest, dispossession always requires an ideology to legitimate it. The problem that Europe, and Spain in particular, faced is that Christianity as a religion is fundamentally committed to the universal. You know, lots of religions are not. Lots of older religions in particular understand themselves or understood themselves as being for particular groups of people, not to have a message that is for all of humankind. But you know, some people argue, like the contemporary French philosopher Alain Badiou, that the very idea, I mean, this may be contested, but this is what Badiou says, of the universal as a political religious project emerges not with Jesus Christ, who Badiou would argue sees himself as acting within the framework of Judaism, but with Paul, the apostle. Paul says, here there's no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is in all and is in all. So how do you justify global conquest when your legitimating ideology as a political force is a religious commitment that is universal, is fundamentally universal? Because soon after Columbus arrives in the Caribbean, the Pope gives the European powers the right to enslave the people they find in the Caribbean. Well, in 1537, Pope Paul III is actually asked to rule on whether or not the indigenous inhabitants of the New World are fully human. And he says, yes, they are human, but their souls, they have souls, but their souls are empty. Anima nullis, empty soul in Latin. So because their souls have not yet been full with the message of the resurrected Christ, they are not yet people to whom Europeans have ethical obligations. And anima nullis paves the way for a phrase I'm sure you've all heard, terra nullis, empty lands. The people with empty souls have no real claim to the land on which they're living. They can be dispossessed of that land. They can be killed. They can be enslaved. Now, initially, the justification for conquest in Europe is not racialized in the sense that we understand race today. It's not about the body. It's not about the physicality. It's a religious justification. But that starts to shift, and different people give different dates to it. There's no single event usually that people would hang that shift on. In fact, in a lot of the anti-racist literature, a lot of the black literature going back to Césaire, but still in contemporary times, that moment where the justification for excluding some people from the count of who is fully human is often understood via the work of a play written by William Shakespeare, The Tempest. He composed that play between 1610 and 1611. The Tempest is set in the Caribbean. It's the Tempest, it's a storm, there's a shipwreck, there's a character called Caliban who stands for the indigenous people in the Caribbean, the Caribs. There's a character called Prosperous, the white man. If you read The Tempest, you can immediately see themes about modern racism. You know, Caliban, for instance, is warned by Prospero to keep his scaly hands off Prospero's daughter. The idea that the black man is a threat to the white woman, it's there. This is why in '68, Aimé Césaire reworked The Tempest. His own version is called A Tempest. And he used it as a way of illuminating modern racism. It's really interesting to read that play. If you don't have time to read the whole thing, you just pick it up in the bookshop, go to the second last page, and read the last speech by Caliban. You can, you know, it's so much about race in the 1960s, about the Black Power movement. There's so many resonances with what was happening in South Africa. But at that moment, around about then, in the 17th century, race starts to become about the body. And the standard argument for why this happens is that colonialism in America is predicated, first of all, on the dispossession and the genocide of the indigenous people, but then on forced labor. But initially, a lot of that forced labor comes from Ireland, okay? Ireland, Africa, different parts of the world. Slavery is not tied to the color of skin as it becomes later on. But the Irish, the Africans, the indigenous people in America keep fermenting revolts. They keep running off together. They keep forming free, independent communities. And it's often argued that one way of getting control of the situation on the part of the colonists in America was to really try and divide people on the basis of race. So to say to an Irishman who maybe has been dispossessed in Ireland, had his home burnt down, dispossessed of his land, forced into labor, but to say to him, now you're a white man, you have a right to arrest any escaped black slave. You have this little bit of power over someone else, and to give people an investment in the system of control. But however we understand it, race shifts then. And, 1683, the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, is defeated at the gates of Vienna. Europe really cements its capacity to be a political project on the global stage. And there's a revolution in England, the Glorious Revolution, in 1688. And although liberalism sometimes reaches back when it tells its own story to the 13th century, to the Magna Carta, the first great liberal thinker certainly is John Locke. John Locke is a man who personally is invested in the African slave trade. That's where he invests his own personal wealth. He's very involved in colonialism in the Americas. He writes the Constitution in 1669 for North and South Carolina. And that Constitution legitimates the dispossession of the indigenous people. It legitimates genocide, and it also legitimates the slave trade from Africa. Now, Locke's argument is that the land in the Americas is wasteland. It's uncultivated. Of course, that's totally bogus. I mean, maize is not a naturally occurring crop. Maize is something that the indigenous people in the Americas developed out of a grass that was not edible. It didn't look anything like maize looks. It's through very careful breeding of plants that the mealie as we know it is developed. It's not just the mealie that we get from indigenous cultivation in the Americas. It's tequila, it's chocolate, it's the chili, I mean, I personally couldn't survive without most of those things. But anyway, for Locke, it's wasteland. Therefore, people don't have a right to it. And it's very clear for Locke that the people who occupy that land are also waste. That civil society, as the idea of a space of emancipation, of debate, reason, democratic engagement, does not include those people. They're outside of it. In 1689, he writes his famous book, Two Treaties of Government, which when I was a student, in 1989, in Pietermaritzburg, I was taught as this is the beginning of the philosophy of freedom, and people are still being taught that now. But if you read that book, his politics as it relates to people outside of Europe, and let's be clear, Locke was very brutal to people inside Europe too. I mean, he thought that the children of the poor in England should go to the workhouse at the age of 3. I mean, his philosophy of freedom wasn't for dispossessed people in England. But he says the Native Americans are not joined with the rest of mankind. They don't count as fully human. Their lands are described as the vacant places of America. It's affirmed that God would not want these lands to remain common and uncultivated. He's very clear. Liberal equality could only apply to, this is the quote, creatures of the same species and rank. In other words, liberalism for Locke is not for everyone. He's actually using the language of species as well as the idea of hierarchy, of rank. Now, there's a revolution in America in 1783, and Locke is taken as a key figure in that revolution. So many people who are studying politics in American universities today will be told that Locke, although he was English, is the philosophical father of America. But they taught that uncritically, but it's actually true. If America is founded on genocide and slavery, then and rights for some people only, then Locke is the philosophical father. Now, that American Revolution is a demand for people in America, many of them slave owners, for rights and freedoms against the English king. It's specifically not a demand for those freedoms to be extended to indigenous people and enslaved people in America. It's not the first of the liberal revolutions. There's the Glorious Revolution in England, but it's a great liberal revolution that asserts freedom for basically property-owning white men and specifically denies freedom to everyone else. The French Revolution in 1789 is linked in some ways to the American Revolution, but in the end, it repeats the refusal to declare that the rights that are announced to hold for man, and of course that's immediately challenged by women, one of whom gets her head cut off for doing that, don't extend to Africans who are enslaved in the New World. Now, the standard narrative that you would find within kind of liberal thought when there's a challenge around this evident reality that the liberal revolutions not just didn't act against slavery, but actually saw the extension of slavery, its entrenchment, would be to say, well, look, liberalism opened up a space for freedom and debate. It asserted that people could have these rights to debate, and it created a space of enlightenment that slowly spread out to include more and more people. But there's a very interesting book that's come out a few years ago, it's still quite recent, by an Italian communist thinker called Dominico Losurdo, called On Liberalism. And one of the readings I recommended for this evening is the second last chapter from that book. Now, he argues that in the Netherlands, in England, the United States, and I'm reading from him, is that all of these revolutions meant that the demand for liberty and the justification of the enslavement as well as the decimation or destruction of, obviously in inverted commas, barbarians were closely entwined. Slavery is not something that persisted despite the success of the three liberal revolutions. On the contrary, it experienced its maximum development following that success. Now, that's just an empirical fact. We can debate liberalism, but we can't debate that historical fact. It's quite clear. So for Losurdo, liberal thought from the beginning orbits around a distinction between sacred spaces, England, and profane spaces, or say Spain and Latin America, England, Africa, the Caribbean. So initially, the concept of profane and sacred is spatialized. Later on, it becomes racialized. and it becomes racialized when white people from England are in the Caribbean, they are in the Americas. They want to take those rights with them and to hold them for themselves. So they transfer it from the space onto their own bodies. I just want to read something from Losurdo. The sacred space, the tiny sacred island, is thus delimited with the utmost clarity from the infinite outside profane space. We might say that outside the chosen people, everything tended to be reduced to deconcentrated nature, within whose orbit also came the populations condemned by Jehovah to be wiped off the face of the earth. The destruction fell upon, and he's quoting now from English text of the time, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and ass, or in more pregnant terms, all the souls that breathed, all the inhabitants of the city, and that which grew on the ground. Within this specially profane space, the distinction between man and nature does not seem to emerge, or does not play a prominent role. So in other words, what he's arguing is that in liberal thought and practice, at the beginning, the human, and initially it's tied to religion and ideas of the sacred, is a category from which most of humanity is excluded, very explicitly. Most of humanity is seen as part of nature, not as part of the human world. Now, I can't remember if it was Paulo or Pendile, but when I was asked to come and give a talk, I asked what had been done before. I was told you've done a really careful reading of C.L.R. James's classic book, The Black Jacobins. So I thought, talking about liberalism, it would be good to kind of come back to Haiti a bit. Because, as you know, there was a revolution in Haiti that ended slavery in Haiti. When that revolution was kind of announced by Toussaint Louverture in 1792, in a letter that he wrote to the Colonial Assembly in San Domingo, the language that he uses is very interesting. He denounces slavery in the name of what he calls the eyes of humanity, because he mobilizes a concept of humanity against the exclusion of most people from humanity. He affirms a universal equality. His letter says, "We are your equals by natural right, and if nature pleases itself to diversify colors within the human race, it's neither a crime to be born black nor an advantage to be born white." Now, the Haitian Revolution, results in the end, as you know, you've read James, in the end of slavery in Haiti and the formation of the first independent black republic in the modern world in 1804. And slavery then ends in Brazil in 1831. Britain abolishes slavery in 1834. The United States, of course, only after a massive war in 1863. But I think it's also very important for us to look at the reception of the Haitian Revolution. There's a book by a Haitian historian who died a couple of years ago called Michel-Rolph Trouillot, which, in fact, my wife introduced me to some years back now. I found this book incredibly useful. Michel-Rolph Trouillot, Triullot. It's called Silencing the Past. Now, he's a historian from Haiti. And in this book, he's trying to understand, look, there's three great modern revolutions, okay? America, France, Haiti. But the Haitian Revolution just gets left out of the story, even by the left in Europe. So, Hannah Arendt wrote a famous book about revolutions, and she just leaves Haiti out. Eric Hobsbawm, great Marxist historian, died, I don't know, 5 years ago or something. When he died, the obituary for Hobsbawm in the London Review of Books said, "The man who knew everything." He also wrote a book on revolutions. He also just leaves Haiti out. Just everyone leaves it out. And Trouillot is trying to understand this. And he goes back in the archive to the actual moment of the revolution. And he concludes that the idea that slaves in Haiti, most of whom were born in Africa, in what's now northern Angola and southern Congo, could defeat the three great European powers of the day, Britain, Spain, and France, and win their freedom, was just fundamentally incomprehensible. And he says it was incomprehensible to the slave owners too. He quotes a letter from a colonist writing to his wife in Paris. This is on the eve of the revolution. This is a slave owner on a plantation. He says, "There's no movement among our Negroes. They don't even think of it. They are very tranquil and obedient. A revolt among them is impossible. Freedom for the Negroes is a chimera." This is on the eve of a revolution. In a formulation that has a certain resonance with Fanon's famous quote about cognitive dissidence, Trouillot says, "When reality does not coincide with deeply held beliefs, human beings tend to phrase interpretations that force reality back within the scope of their beliefs." Okay, they devise formulas to repress the unthinkable and to bring reality back within the framework of acceptable forms of discourse. So he says, I'm quoting from him again, "The contention that Africans and their descendants could not envisage freedom, let alone formulate strategies for gaining and securing such freedom, was not based on empirical evidence." Obviously, because the empirical evidence was that all the great European powers of the day were defeated. It was based on an ontology, an implicit organization of the world and its inhabitants. If any of you haven't come across the term ontology, it's a term in philosophy that refers to being, what it is to be. What Trouillot is saying is that from, the late 1700s through to when he was writing his book, which I think came out in 1995, there was an assumption in the authorized sites of intellectual production in Europe, continuously over a period of 200 years, that African people were not capable of doing what African slaves did in Haiti. And that overdetermined any reading of empirical evidence. Now, that's not solely about liberalism, because he's including the left. He's very clear that even at the time of the revolution, the extreme left in France, this is after the French Revolution, could not make sense of it. So it's not just about liberalism, it's about a broader colonial mindset of which liberalism is one part. But he concluded when he wrote his book in 1995 that the narrative structures of Western historiography have not broken with the ontological order of the Renaissance. Now, if your claim to legitimate liberalism is that it creates the space for free debate and so on, where things can slowly progress, this is a fairly devastating critique that Trouillot is making. Now, I think if we want to understand liberalism in the modern world, it makes a lot of sense for us to think about Haiti after the revolution. I mean, it's been spoken about now a lot, but often the story stops in 1804. One thing is very important to understand. I don't know if you've discussed this already, and James doesn't always deal with this the best. There's other texts that do better, like Caroline Fick, for instance, that there was real conflict between the mass of the participants in that revolution who were born in Africa and the leaders who were mostly, like Toussaint Louverture, people who were born in the colony. And one of the lines of conflict was over what the future of an independent Haiti would look like. Toussaint wanted to keep the plantation system. He wanted to run the plantation system, but not with slave labor. He saw that as how a way to build an independent modern republic. But most of the participants in that revolution wanted to restore the kind of small-scale agriculture that they had known in Africa. They wanted to have autonomy and land. And that's what they got. And a lot of readings that see the revolution as failed because it didn't build a capitalist economy fail to understand that people did win land and autonomy, and that they held it for quite a long time before they lost it progressively via an alliance of local elites and American, in particular, imperialism. But of course, the revolution was also welcomed all over the world. I mean, it traveled mostly via ships, via sailors, via ports. So, for instance, sailors from Haiti told people working on the docks, workers on the docks in Havana and Cuba about the revolution. Its declarations were translated into Spanish, resulting in rebellions in Cuba that were smashed. It's often been suggested, although there's no clear evidence for this, that the slave revolt here in Cape Town in 1808 was in response to the revolution in Haiti, that the story would have come via the docks. But it's really important to understand what happened to Haiti. What happened to Haiti at the hands of liberal states. In 1825, the French forced the Haitian government to pay a debt for the loss of the slaves. The amount of money that had been lost was calculated, and that debt had to be paid back to France. They only finished paying it in 1947, just after the Second World War. By the end of the 19th century, 80% of the money available to the Haitian state was going on this debt. There was no sense there that that slavery was a moral crime. I mean, until 1947, that debt was still being paid back. Now, Mamdani argues that another really important date in how kind of colonial thought, and this would include liberal thought, shifted is the mutiny in India in 1857, along with the uprising in Morant Bay in Jamaica in 1865. And for Mamdani, it became clear that after a series of revolts, the Haitian Revolution being a major one, but continuing after the Haitian Revolution and continuing after the end of slavery, the uprising in Jamaica was an uprising by freed slaves, okay? Is that colonialism needed to find new forms of control. Simply using brute force wasn't working. It was resulting in these uprisings. So for him, the idea of the native becomes a key technology for controlling people in the colonized world. He says that, contrary to commonly held views, the native, I'm quoting from Mamdani here, does not designate a condition that is original and authentic. It's a colonial construction via which the person designated as the native is pinned down, localized, thrown out of civilization as an outcast, confined to custom, confined to the realm of custom. So the colonizer inhabits the realm of the universal. The colonized is declared to be a native who inhabits the realm of the particular. The colonizer inhabits a space of motion and change and openness to science and to the world. The colonized is in a space of stasis, stuck. Okay? He says this colonial imagination presents a walled, isolated, and unchanging affair in the non-West, as opposed to a transformative one in the West. The colonial state paid heed to a single characteristic, origin, and totally regarded all others, including residence. The native is read as a product of geography rather than history. Colonized people are outside of the realm of history, of change, of innovation. Now, it's just after this that John Stuart Mill writes his book on liberty, which our students are still being taught, is where the conversation about freedom begins. Now, Mill is a more gentle figure than Locke in some respects, but he still is, like his father, works his job. He works for British colonialism. He works for the British India Company. He's part of this project of rethinking colonial domination. And his essay on liberty, which is about liberty, of course, for some, is absolutely clear about this. Mill says, despotism is a legitimate mode of government when dealing with barbarians. It's straight up, it's not hidden. You don't need to have studied in some, arcane realm of discourse to understand what he's saying. He's quite clear. The freedoms he's talking about do not apply to barbarians. And that's Irish people, it's people in the Americas, it's people in Asia, it's people in Africa, it's most of humanity are excluded from the sphere of freedom. And this stuff has real consequences. When Rhodes gives his famous speech, Cecil John Rhodes, in Parliament here in Cape Town in 1887, he says, "We must adopt a system of despotism in our relations with the barbarians of South Africa." He doesn't cite Mill, but I think it's quite evident that he's referring to John Stuart Mill. This stuff has real consequences. Now, if we go back to Haiti, Haiti's invaded by the United States, by the Marines, in 1915. And the main reason for the invasion is that there's a lot of debt now owed to the US. And there are various rebellious forces in Haiti that are trying to capture control of the island. And there's a good chance that they're going to refuse to pay that debt. This is not the debt to the French for slavery. This is new debt that leaders in Haiti have acquired. So they send in the Marines. And the first thing they do is take control of the treasury and the harbor and the customs. And they start getting control of the flows of money, and they start taking that money to the US to pay off the debt. They institute a system of what they call civil conscription, which is forced labor. It's not quite slavery, but it's also not quite not slavery. They develop an army, a Haitian army, trained by the US, set up by the US, that will only ever be used against the Haitian people. And most of those soldiers are from the South. They're extremely racist. And the idea that African spiritual practices in Haiti are perverse and evil, this whole nonsense around voodoo, enters the American mainstream imagination through a series of films that are linked to this occupation. Haiti starts to occupy the space in the American imagination of this little bit of Africa just off the coast of Florida, this threatening, dangerous space. Now, the Russian Revolution in 1917, I'm sure you all know enough about that, but there's one aspect of it that Losurdo, not in the book on liberalism, but in a more recent book, which is, it's recent in English, but stuff is being translated now. He argues very interestingly that reactionary historians in England and America are kind of consistently trying to make a comparison between Hitler and Stalin. To say Hitler is a response to Stalin. These are two very authoritarian regimes, and the Nazis are responding to the Bolsheviks, and ultimately that's where the blame for fascism in Europe lies. What Losurdo shows is that whatever the flaws and the crimes of the Soviet Union were, and he does not shy away from them, the communist impulse took a universal form, and there was consistent support from the Soviet Union for national liberation struggles, that people like Lenin, Trotsky, were in constant dialogue with thinkers like in India and places like this around the world. He also shows that the inspiration for Nazism comes directly from, in particular, English colonialism. And this is not, it can't be disputed because Hitler writes about this in Mein Kampf. He wanted to do to Eastern Europe what the British had done to the Americas, the Caribbean, and Africa. He wanted to conquer, dispossess, and enslave the populations of Eastern Europe and set up new lands for German settlers. He was engaged in a project of colonialism in Europe. The idea of race that becomes so fundamental to fascism comes out of liberal thought, particularly in in England. Now, Amy Césaire, of course, makes this point. More contemporary thinkers like Mahmoud Mamdani have really made it. Mamdani has shown that the German state commits its first genocide in what's now Namibia, and later commits genocide in Europe. Césaire calls it the boomerang effect. You know, colonialism says you can do certain things to those people over there, but you can't do them here. But they become normalized and they return to Europe. But of course, the end of World War II, the defeat of the Nazis, the recognition of what has happened with the Holocaust, means the beginning of the end of that period where biological racism, claims about the body, is considered legitimate. It's not decisive. We've got to remember that, you know, although India gets its independence shortly after World War II in 47, you know, apartheid, you know, begins in South Africa in 48. Israel is formed as a state in 48. You know, white supremacy is not challenged in the southern states of the US. You know, the last lynching happens in 1968. It's not challenged in Australia. You have the White Australia policy until 73. But there's a beginning of a break with this kind of sense of racism being legitimated through biology. There's a shift to culture. These people are now framed in this racist language as being behind, as needing development. Okay, it's framed as they will one day catch up. It's a different language. Of course, you know, you get all the independence struggles in Africa, which are a major challenge to racism, and you get the civil rights struggle in the 60s in the US, and then the Black Power movement, also a major challenge. But from the beginning, there's a critique, and Fanon, of course, is the first person to do this, of these newly emerging post-colonial states. We'll talk much more about Fanon, but you know, he was the ambassador for the Algerian liberation movement. He traveled around West Africa, North Africa, down to the Congo. He saw what was happening with these new states, developed a really important critique of them. You get that same critique emerging, although it originally emerges as a result of a study of the subject of historiography, the writing of history in India, amongst the Subaltern Studies School, who argue that although after colonialism, Indian elites take over lots of positions of power and authority in India, the structure of society remains very much like it was under colonialism. The elitism remains the same. Certain people are still excluded from the domain of the rational. They're not seen as being capable of rational, even though it's now Indian people doing it to other Indians. Fanon makes similar points. You know, Mamdani, of course, makes a whole set of arguments about how post-colonial societies in Africa continue to control people through systems that are set up under colonialism. The idea of the native, the idea that rights are not made available to everyone. But if we go back to Haiti, Haiti in this period, in the Cold War, is run by a dictatorship. From 57 to 86, the Duvaliers, first the father and then the son. A most extraordinarily brutal dictatorship, backed by the US, but also Canada and France, because it's anti-communist. A dictatorship that relies on terror to govern its people and results in wholesale plunder by one family, essentially. But by the late 1980s, there's a beginning of a mass movement in Haiti against the dictatorship. There's also a mass movement in the Philippines and here in South Africa. And there's an amazing book, I think, by a guy called William Robinson that looks very scrupulously and closely at documents produced by the US state about how it's going to maintain its dominance in a situation in which dictatorships are losing their credibility. Botha here, Somoza in Nicaragua, Duvalier in Haiti, Marcos in the Philippines. These dictators are all losing their credibility. And the argument that is made is that, look, these mass movements that are emerging against these dictators don't just want to remove dictators. They want a broader transformation of society. They want more radical conceptions of democracy. They want people to be able to participate in decision making. They want to change the economy. They want to change relations to land. They're a threat to American interests. We need to move away from the dictators. We need to have systems of representative democracy in which people themselves have very little power and authority. And a key technique that's introduced at this point is the idea of civil society. The idea that small NGOs with no popular mandate, with no democratic base to claim to represent anyone, will operate within a kind of liberal sphere and claim to represent people. And there's big investments made, including here in Cape Town, via the US state, in an organization called IDASA, that try to move things towards this kind of less democratic conception of democracy.
Just the name of the book?
Polyarchy. Polyarchy, 1996, William Robinson. So, the movement in Haiti, mass movement, coheres around a charismatic priest. There's a moment where a church at which he's preaching is attacked, people are massacred. He really becomes a kind of figure. His name is Jean-Bertrand Aristide. And in 1990, he wins by an overwhelming majority, the first free and fair election. This is the same moment in which it becomes possible for South Africans to vote. It's the end of the Cold War. The US doesn't think they have to back these dictatorships. They want to move towards more liberal democratic arrangements. So just as we are able to get liberal democracy, so too in Haiti. Aristide is elected. He draws a lot on liberation theology that comes out of Latin America. He speaks a theological language. He wants to say that there's a spark of the divine in every human being. And it's a sin to oppress people, to exclude people, to disrespect people. But he's removed within a year by the army in Haiti, by a US-backed coup. He's returned to power in '94 by Bill Clinton as a result largely of pressure from the Black Caucus in the US. But when he comes back to power, he is given extraordinary constraints over the economic realm. He's basically given a structural adjustment program and told you can't move outside of that. So he has power, but he doesn't. Now, the movement that Aristide came to represent, La Valasse, means the avalanche in Haitian Creole, is largely based amongst peasants and the urban poor. It's often based in small church groups. It's a challenge to elites in Haiti. And there's another coup in 2004. This time, the coup is directly organized by the US military. The Marines come, they take Aristide out of his house, and they put him on a plane, and they fly him to the Central African Republic. But there's a huge amount of ideological work that is done before the coup. And that ideological work takes the form of small, usually US-backed organizations, usually organizations that are run by elite figures in Haiti, ex-World Bank person who runs factories, sweatshops, and they present themselves as civil society and therefore as democratic and therefore as legitimate, even though La Valasse has won every election it stood for with an overwhelming majority. There's a beginning of armed actions, because the first thing Aristide did on taking power was demobilize the Haitian army. But people are brought in from the Dominican Republic. There's things like attacks on police stations. Here in South Africa, you reading our press in post-apartheid South Africa, Aristide is demonized in our press. He's presented, Tony Leon calls him the Mugabe of the Caribbean. Aristide is not perfect, but it's the freest, least violent, least corrupt regime that Haiti's had in more than 100 years. The opposition have never been elected, but they're using this label of civil society. And in many of our newspapers, this is reported unproblematically. In 2004, it's obviously the bicentennial of the Haitian Revolution. That's the year of the coup. I mean, Aristide tells the French they have to pay back all this money that was paid to them as the debt. He's very explicitly warned that this is going to be very dangerous for him to ask for this money to be paid back. The only president in the whole world who goes to participate in the commemoration of the bicentennial of the Haitian Revolution is Thabo Mbeki. He is pilloried in our media. It's presented as a farce, as a joke, as an embarrassment. But if you read the statements that Thabo Mbeki put out at the time, his speech, absolutely rational. He talks about the significance of the Haitian Revolution as an event in the modern world. He talks about its fate, about its course. He talks about the necessity to stand and affirm that moment. When Aristide is removed from power, he's interviewed by Peter Hallward, a brilliant philosopher. The interview is published in the London Review of Books. And he says, everything comes back in the end to that simple principle. He's using a phrase in Haitian Creole, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, tout mot son mot. Each person is indeed a person. Every person is capable of thinking things through for themselves. Those who don't accept this, when they look at the Negres of Haiti, and consciously or unconsciously that's what they see people who are too poor, too crude, too uneducated to think for themselves. They see people who need others to make their decisions for them. It's a colonial mentality, and still very widespread amongst our political class. The elites in Haiti, lighter skinned and richer than the majority of the Haitian population, are the ones that are backing that coup. They're working with the US state. The language that Aristide is using is the same language that Toussaint Louverture is using more than 200 years before. It's a language of universal humanity. It's a language that says that certain people have been excluded from the count of who is human. And I would argue, I mean, it's not my own idea, I'm taking this from people like Lewis Gordon and others, that you can trace an arc from Louverture. He's usually referred to, by the way, as Toussaint, by his first name, even though Louverture is the name he chose for himself. It means the opening in French. But, you know, like Saddam Hussein is referred to as Saddam. Like, who gets referred to by their first name and who gets referred to, there's a politics to these things. So we call him Louverture, not Toussaint. Louverture, from Louverture, you can trace this commitment to this idea of the necessity to assert a universal humanity through a black radical tradition that runs through people like Fanon, through people like Césaire. Here in South Africa, someone like Biko talked about a true humanity. Césaire talks about a humanity made to the measure of the world. Okay? Contemporary black thinkers in the US, radical thinkers like Lewis Gordon, would do the same. What Aristide is saying is that some people in Haiti are still excluded from the count of the human. And, you know, contemporary post-colonial theory continues to argue again and again that there's this line of division. It's not necessarily anymore about race in the same way that it was. So Mamdani would argue in the post-colony in Africa, it's about who counts as a person who is able to have a role in civil society and who must be governed by traditional authority. In India, Partha Chatterjee, who draws on that subaltern studies school, argue that if you look at Indian cities, most people, everyone might have rights in principle, but most people in practice don't. If you occupy land unlawfully, you connect yourself to water and electricity, perhaps sewerage as well, unlawfully, you are violating the law. You're outside of civil society. You are not treated by the state as a legitimate member of it. He says you're outside of the zone of legitimate political discourse. You are treated essentially as criminal. You see the same things in Latin America. The political theorists, the activists who come out of struggles in Venezuela, in Bolivia, again and again, they write about people, often the urban poor, often people who are indigenous or black, who are, this is Raul Zabechi, always considered irrational. Okay? For Zabechi, there's a kind of epistemological earthquake when those who have occupied the depths of society for centuries emerge as subjects. What all these thinkers are arguing in Latin America and Africa and Asia is that colonialism produces an ontological split, a division between who counts as fully human and who doesn't. That it continually changes, it's dynamic, it's porous, it evolves through different moments in history, but that in our societies, there are still groups of people, large groups of people, who are outside of those who are really considered, irrespective of what the law says, but in practice, to have rights. And certainly if you look at popular struggles in South Africa today, I mean, there's all kinds of discourses, some of them sometimes reactionary, xenophobic, and so on. But again and again, here in Cape Town, in Durban, Johannesburg, Afrikaans, Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, doesn't matter what language people are speaking. Again and again, you will encounter people affirming themselves as human. Not all the time, but it's very frequently there. You know, often you read a report about a road blockade somewhere, and if someone's interviewed and they're not, the whole thing isn't just dismissed as criminal, you might read an account of a woman saying, "We are human beings, not dogs." And you think back to Losurdo about liberalism at its outset, classifying certain people closer to the animal world than the human world. But very seldom is this kind of assertion in South Africa taken seriously when people think about political ideas, to take theory as something to engage with radically. But that's not the case in Latin America, where movements and struggles, although they're facing serious setbacks at the moment in Venezuela and in Bolivia and of course in Brazil, intellectuals have taken this kind of stuff very seriously. Some intellectuals here do. I mean, Achille Mbembe, he's not connected to grassroots struggles, but it's very interesting to me that he writes, he's talking about South Africa, for the democratic project to have any future at all, it should necessarily take the form of a conscious attempt to retrieve life and the human from a history of waste. Now, we're very familiar in South Africa with critiques of liberalism that focus about its naturalization, its normalization of the market and the wage relation and exploitation and exclusion in the economy. We're all very fluent in that, and I don't intend at all to be suggesting that that is not of the utmost significance, but we know that. We're also familiar with the way in which liberalism has intersected with white supremacy, with white claims to domination. Of course, liberalism can also be taken up by black people. Liberalism, in terms of institutions, ideas, can also be black. But what I wanted to suggest for this opening discussion, to prepare us for the discussion on Fanon, to think about Fanon's location in the black radical tradition and what he can bring to us here and now, is that we also need to think about liberalism as, in Losurdo's terms, from the beginning, a philosophy of a certain kind of freedom for a certain kind of people. That has changed over the years, it's not constant, but from the beginning, it's been premised on a split at the level of ontology, the level of how we imagine the human, between who fully counts as human and who doesn't. And that from the beginning, I'm not saying every form of rebellion or every theory that is articulated to rebellion, but from the beginning, rebellion, and I use the example of Haiti because you've been talking about Haiti, has very frequently formulated itself in terms of the affirmation of the human as a universal category. And that's certainly for what Lewis Gordon would call the black radical tradition that's been a constant feature, the affirmation of the universal. Now, I mean, Amy Césaire, I think in 56, says, look, what happens after independence? People get abstract rights. Now, we're told again and again that the Constitution is the kind of realization, the accumulation of a long history of struggle here. We're not the first group, the first society to encounter a shift from explicit oppression to abstract rights. But Césaire says equality refuses to remain abstract. So when he talks about a universal humanity, he's talking about affirmation of equality as an immediate axiomatic principle, not something to be posed as something to be arrived at always in the future yet to come. Haiti, I want to just make it clear, has not to this day been able to elect the government of its choosing. Aristide was removed by the US military. His party, Lavalas, has simply not been able to stand in any of the 3 elections since. Those elections are run by the US. The UN has been part of this as well. I mean, they sent in their soldiers. I mean, after the coup in 2004, at least 5,000 people, mostly Lavalas supporters, were killed. Simply not allowed to stand. Those little groups who are calling themselves civil society, whenever they've stood, they've had zero support. Absolutely zero. The person who won the last election is a kind of former pop star, a celebrity whose program is about, you know, keeping the sweatshops that make products for companies like Disney. But what does it mean if, in our contemporary world, the countries that claim the liberal tradition, that claim moral leadership, still flatly refuse to allow people in Haiti to govern themselves? Without any apology. I mean, Lavalas simply cannot compete in the election. You're just not allowed.